We're at Great Shepherd's Garden, and the reason we're here today is because we really want to show everybody what you can do with very low water gardening. Water is becoming a really important resource for us, so this is an important thing to embrace in whatever way you can. So it would be a small step or a large step, depending upon how big of a step you want to take, right?
Yeah. Well, we've got bull run water, we've got lots of rainfall, we've got aquifers that seem endless. We've got the Columbia River, we've got the Willamette River, but those are all limited resources. And as much as we would like to think we've got infinite water supplies, we really don't.
Right. So here we are. So let's take a tour. So tell us a little bit about what you've got planted here.
So my garden here is 6 years old, so it doesn't look like it, but things grow fast here in Oregon.
Yeah.
I planted this garden with several things in mind. First off, I wanted to do a low to no water garden. So in owning a nursery, I also wanted to experiment with a lot of the plants that we grow, kind of see how they would do.
Anybody else?
Exactly. I'm like, it's easy to do that
Yeah.
if you're a plant nut and you can buy too many plants and not have room to plant them. So I found in gardening, it's kind of nice to have those limitations that keep you focused. So I wanted to stay focused when I did this garden. So using the plants that I grow to test them out and see how well they do through winters, through summers, but most importantly with their water use. So which plants really are the lowest water use plants and don't need any supplemental irrigation. So that was kind of the concept that started off this garden. And a lot of my favorite plants happen to be low water plants. So
How lucky for you.
Lucky for me. Like this guy right here, a good example, one of my favorites is a manzanita. Arctostaphylos harmony is that cultivar. There's so many different manzanitas that are native up and down the West Coast. It's a really good example of a West Coast native that's underused in gardens. You can drive around town and not really see them that often the way you would, say, a vine maple or an Oregon grape. And one of the ideas we had when we started our business was trying to introduce people to things that do so well here and look so natural here but aren't readily available.
Right, and nice texture on that too.
Oh yeah, and it's a lot of Arctostaphylos or manzanitas will start blooming in the winter, so they're really good forage for the hummingbirds that overwinter. Right. You get a lot of leafcutter bees in the summer that'll come along. There's a lot of, you can see some little critters floating around there now, but the early winter blooming thing is kind of interesting. They're often overlooked as a good winter blooming shrub.
Right. So what is that?
This is a plant called bird of paradise shrub. It's native to South America, to kind of a similar part of South America that has a strong seasonal dry season. It's a more common landscape plant down in California and Arizona, but when I first moved to Portland, I saw one growing in a garden and it was in full bloom, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. This actually grows well here. Yes, I must have it. And it's one of my favorites because it blooms all summer without any water at all. So it's a heat lover, something you want to plant right against the south wall of the house.
And against the brick.
Yep, exactly.
And with the driveway.
And with the, yep, lots of reflected heat.
Right. Michael and I were just talking about the fact that a really good place to have to start the small step of low water gardening is in a parking strip, because or hell strips as people call them, because most of the time there's no water out in between your sidewalk and the curb, and so this is just perfect for that kind of stuff.
And again, like on the south side of the house, I chose plants that will take the reflected heat off the concrete. Our climate kind of has a reputation of being this cold, damp, rainy place, and that's definitely the case for part of the year. But like standing here on a day that's about to be 95 degrees, it's like you can feel it already. So with this, I chose a lot of plants that weren't going to get too tall, so it wouldn't block the line of sight, but also plants that would fill in and cover the ground. One thing I've found with low water gardening is the more dense you plant, the more you insulate that soil layer, helps conserve soil moisture. It also keeps down the weeds quite a bit.
And everybody loves to weed.
And people just love weeding, yes.
Yeah.
So like this is as a 6-year-old planting, minimal summer irrigation. The maintenance on this is almost nothing. There's a few grasses that I cut back in the winter, so it's kind of that late winter cleanup thing. Rely a lot on evergreen shrubs, covered in flowers when it blooms without needing much water at all. So it's not something that looks uninteresting. It's
That's
got
good.
something going on throughout the year.
Yeah.
Bottle brushes from Australia, that's another favorite of mine. They have kind of a unique texture. They're evergreen, really pretty flowers that the hummingbirds love.
The thing that I really like most is that throughout your garden, what you've done is you have relied on leaf color and texture more than blossom, because that is what gives it the staying power.
Yeah.
And also the low maintenance too, so you're not deadheading anything.
Yeah,
you know.
I kind of wanted to avoid, there's a lot of common garden plants, perennials, that'll pop up, do their thing, be gorgeous, but then they leave kind of a gap where you either have to cut it back or it's just a blob that's there.
Right.
I kind of wanted to avoid that and use plants that had something interesting going on. So when they're out of bloom, they've got interesting foliage. The euphorbia is a good example of that. They're really pretty when they bloom
Which is right
in
there. Yeah.
February. Brilliant chartreuse flowers, but then when they're done blooming, you've got this gorgeous foliage that's kind of like a sculptural art piece.
Yeah,
in
and
its
you
own
know,
right.
let's talk a little bit about that euphorbia, because we started talking about that
Yeah.
before we actually turned on the cameras, and this is a really good story.
So this is a species of euphorbia, our conclusion was basically is if you live near a wild area, this might be the kind of plant you wouldn't want to plant. It is a heavy seeder. So in my garden, I kind of like things that will seed around a little bit, but it's not a plant for everybody. You got a little bit of a toxic sap issue, so it's a beauty, but it's also dangerous.
Yeah, dangerous.
But it's a good example of a plant that if you're near a wild area, you want to pay attention to plants that reseed a little too much, too aggressively when they're non-native. There's another species of euphorbia that's become highly invasive in Utah, covering a lot of acreage of rangeland. So it's another good thing to keep in mind, is like checking local invasive plant lists and stuff, and make sure you're not introducing something that's going to get out of control.
So just so people know, this euphorbia is rigida.
Rigida, and it is not. It's only hardy to about 10 degrees, so it's not going to spread out into really cold areas. The seeds spread by popping, so they've done their work here
Right.
in the garden
Yeah.
of making it look really cool and natural. But one of the reasons I like it is in a small space like this, it's kind of fun to have a little variability year to year, and I kind of like that there's a few other plants, the California poppies we'll see in a moment, that kind of seed themselves into different
Yeah.
areas, so your design kind of changes over the years, and it's almost like the garden designs itself in a way, because you get it started, but it kind of sustains itself.
Yeah, serendipity, right?
Exactly,
Yeah.
yeah.
Let's move on a little bit.
Yeah. That is a variety of sedum, native to the Mediterranean. Sedum sediforme is the common name. I love this one because it blooms in the summer. It's got the really cool coral-like sedum foliage in the winter that you'd kind of expect, but it behaves kind of like a flowering perennial. It's like over the top in flower. And yeah, all sorts of bees love sedum. Another good example of how it doesn't necessarily have to be a native plant to attract native pollinators. A lot of what we're seeing here is European honeybee, but if you look closely, there's also like leafcutter bees, native bumblebees, all kinds of small flies that'll attract to this plant. One of the reasons I like it, just behind it here, we've got a white form of California poppy, which is one of my favorites. So that species is native all up and down the west coast, but the white flowered form I find to be really cool and soothing, and it blooms for about 6 months out of the year.
Yeah, that's sensational. When I saw your garden this spring,
Yeah.
you had it interplanted with some, I don't know how many little blue flowering annuals
Yeah.
of different kinds.
Yes.
And it was just, I mean, it was like a fairy garden.
Oh yeah.
And I thought, oh man, this is so great.
That was my fun. I've also found it's good to leave one part of your garden that changes often to kind of give you a lot of, because like in a garden like this, it's 6 years old. I don't really have room to plant anything anymore. It's full, but you need that connection to your garden to get you out there in the dirt. So I had a bed in the backyard that was a vegetable garden, which I decided was a little too much water for my tastes. So I decided to turn it into a wildflower bed. So I used a lot of native annuals that will do their thing in the spring, so they germinate in the winter with the rainfall. They're evergreen as seedlings all the way through the winter, and then in the spring they pop up and bloom. So it's a good example of something that's like really showy flowering, but totally in tune with our natural environment,
Right.
where rain is what activates them to grow, and then
Right.
drought is what activates them to set their seed and
Right.
go dormant. Or yeah.
You know, when people talk about dry gardens, oftentimes what they think of are spiky, thorny, sticky things.
Yeah.
And what I really like about yours is so blossomy and
Delicate in places.
delicate, yeah, finely textured, but at the same time it's voluptuous.
Yeah.
And you just, that doesn't come to mind when you think about a dry garden. So this
Exactly.
is such a nice example of that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I like flowers. I like spiky things too, but sometimes if you go if you go too deserty, from my personal taste, is it looks a little out of place in Oregon. If you go all the way like Palm Springs,
Yeah.
which I love that look. With this, I wanted something that was a little more in tune to what you'd see when you go out into the wild. So say you go up to Mount Hood, you've got our native manzanita in shrub communities with some deciduous things, some grasses, some wildflowers. I kind of wanted to mimic that kind of look, which is a little more lush, because we do get all that rain. So it definitely supports a wider variety of things than just the pure desert species.
Right, right. Okay, so we've moved from the front yard to the backyard, and it's just as cool back here as it is in the front.
Thank you. Yeah, this space was a little bit more of a challenge to design, if you will. It's kind of small, enclosed space, but I wanted it to be something that had a lot of interest because this is where we hang out a lot. So I wanted a lot of things going on, a lot of things blooming throughout the summer, and things that will tolerate a lot of this is shaded in the winter, but then sunny in the summer. So it's not quite the full shade garden. This bed we're standing next to is turned out to be one of my favorites. It was very challenging to figure out what I was going to grow here. One thing I like about this bed is that it's so densely planted that there's no maintenance at all. I found when I was doing my spring cleanup this year, this bed, I didn't even touch anything in this bed because everything had grown together so well that it just formed this one foliage carpet. And then we get a lot of Pacific Coast irises that pop up here in the spring.
Yeah.
So this area really, I like how it turned out.
I especially like these wonderful, what did you call them, white poppies?
Yeah, it's a white form of the native California poppy. Another one of my favorite plants that I use a lot is this little grass here. It's another West Coast native, Festuca rubra, which is a creeping grass. I found this is a great plant to add in underneath larger things that provides that dense ground cover. Keeps the weeds back, also keeps the soil a lot cooler. And this plant is one that it doesn't seed around at all, but it's growing by the roots. It'll kind of fill in where the other plants aren't. So if it ends up being unhappy where it is, it kind of ends up moving itself in.
Oh, that's cool.
It's a really good one for filling in blank spaces. There's a lot of people in horticulture that talk about what they call ecological based gardening. A lot of people on the East Coast are writing a lot about it, and one of those important tenets is always don't leave the bare earth. So the bare bark dust is basically the dead zone where nothing's alive. Soil dries out faster. You've got less soil microorganisms going on.
More weeds.
So
More maintenance.
more maintenance basically.
Yeah.
So when you dense plant like this, it doesn't have to be one solid ground cover. That was always the traditional landscaping way of covering up that ground is planting a ground cover.
Right.
Which, in years past people would plant ivy or things like that. That's tons of maintenance, right? So just with this bed, I wanted to create a real diverse environment. There's about 20 different species in here. So it's dynamic. You get lots of different texture, flowering throughout the season, but it still does the job of insulating the earth, covering the ground.
Yeah, yeah. The Eryngium is lovely.
Holly? Sea holly, yeah. This plant is kind of cool. It's got the common name Miss Wilmot's Ghost. Apparently, where there was Miss Wilmot's Ghost, there was an avid gardener in the UK back quite a while ago, I believe, who was famous for dropping seeds of this plant in gardens she would visit. And the thing about this plant is it takes a while to germinate, so it doesn't show up until the following season. So the seedlings would pop up, and the seedlings are kind of just a normal green leaf. You wouldn't notice them, but then they pop out and bloom in their second year. So Miss Wilmot kind of left her calling card in all the gardens she had visited.
That could be nasty.
So yeah, exactly. So I kind of like it for that reason. But it's a member, believe it or not, related to carrots, and anything in the carrot family is very good for pollinators. So not just European honeybees, but native bees. There's all kinds of small wasps, flies, mason bees like this one too. The flowers have no fragrance, so for people they're just pretty, but for pollinators apparently it's quite the real deal.
Yeah. You have to be a little careful where you plant that because it is a little sticky.
It's on the spiny side.
Yeah, it's
yes.
on the spiny
The
side.
plant that deserves respect.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And and you can see the foliage of that one. It'll kind of spread around. So those will be my next year's flowers. So it kind of changes year to year. So
That's
again,
good.
going back to that idea, mix it up a little bit so
Right.
it's not just a static landscape.
One of the things that I'm reminded of looking in your garden here is that with all the different plants, this is actually warfare going on in front of us. This is very, very, very slow scale warfare.
Who's gonna survive?
Yeah.
Who's going to survive?
That was part of the goal with this bed. Is I had grown a lot of these for work, and I decided I want to plant them all out, color coordinated, of course, like all blues and whites, a little bit of yellow, but to see how they would do, how well they would reseed. There's a couple West Coast natives. Meadow foam is one that comes to mind. They've already completely disappeared. You wouldn't even know they're there. But that's a good one that germinates first thing in the fall, forms a really good winter ground cover. The other plant I have back here, you can't see it now, is another native miner's lettuce,
Yeah.
which also happens to be an edible green. It's actually often marketed as a gourmet green, high in vitamin C. It is an aggressive self-seeder, but I just kind of pull it out of areas that I don't want it to be. But this bed in the winter is a solid, lush green carpet of those miner's lettuce leaves. And they kind of start to go dormant the minute we get warm. So like when it gets to May, they've already started to die down, and that's about when all of these wildflowers were at their peak. Yeah, we've got one of my favorites is the Clarkia. Farewell to Spring is the common name of that. That's an Oregon native species down into California, and it's one of the later blooming ones. So a lot of the other seed heads are already forming that kind of thing, more of that dry summer look. But this guy is still going strong.
Yeah, so who would think that this is absolutely a no water area?
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing and lush and bountiful, I think.
Yeah. Bumblebees agree.
Yeah, they do. So here we are at your nursery.
Yay.
And the name of it is?
This is Xera Plants. So we are a local company, 5 people, so pretty small nursery. And we are growers, and we also have a retail shop. So we grow all of our own plants, propagate all our own stuff. So we get to kind of pick and choose what we want to have and what we want to grow. So we've been in business for, 18 years now.
Wow.
So
You're getting to be the old kids on the block.
I know, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, we started out kind of as a wholesale nursery, and we were talking earlier about kind of our origins. We started out growing specialty annuals, including tuberous begonias in various shapes and sizes.
Which are really popular.
Yeah, exactly. And over the years, our interest kind of gravitated toward the low water use segment of our inventory, which is we do grow things that need summer irrigation, but we tend to concentrate on things that are good with our minimal summer rainfall. So over the years, we kind of intellectually pursued that, also based upon our own experiences gardening. We found a lot of these plants to be super easy to grow here, look great all season. So that's kind of how our nursery ended up being more of a low water use nursery.
Right, so you started out as Viva.
Started out as Viva.
And when I
Plants,
saw
was
that
our
tag
original
go
name.
away, I thought, oh no, they're out of business. But then you reemerged.
Yep.
as
The new
Xera.
name and our name Xera is based upon the Greek word xeric, which refers to low water use. So we kind of did a play off that, just to not have it to be too literal. Yeah, so we have a farm down near Sherwood, and our retail shops here in Southeast Portland, and so we grow about 1,000 different plants. These days, our fastest growing sector is West Coast native plants. There's actually a huge interest in that, especially with new home buyers. Pollinator friendly plants are always a big hit, and the low water use. So a lot of people come in looking for things that combine those 3 aspects, but especially the natives. And so we love seeking out a lot of unusual, not often grown native plants, because there's quite a few, both from Oregon and Northern California, to introduce people to.
Yeah, but then, you're the bad boys on the block and you bring in things that are really, really rare and beautiful and,
Exactly, gotta have fun.
make you drool, that kind of stuff.
Yep,
Yeah.
keep things diverse.
Well, this is one of my favorite places to bring clients because it just is like a candy store. And it's also one of my very favorite places to shop for myself. So,
Awesome.
yeah,
Thank you.
and you pack a lot into just a little tiny space.
Yeah, we like to keep it not super overwhelming. You know, we are a small grower, so we obviously don't grow like a million different things, but we like to keep it easily interpreted, because I think a lot of times when people get started in gardening, it can be really overwhelming. And so it's, if you don't really know your plants, which most of our customers do not, you don't want to overwhelm them with too many choices. So we kind of direct people toward the plants that we find to be really good performers, something they're going to succeed with, and that'll give them a lot of return, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
They're not fussy
Yes.
or picky,
Yeah.
or you can kill really
Right.
fast.
We have a few of those, but we always tell people like
But you-
this one's really fussy.
Right. Be careful. Be careful.
So we have a lot of people, for instance, that want Madrone trees, which are native, and they're very difficult to get established. So it's like you buy 3 and 1 will live, that kind of thing. As long as you know that.
Yeah. Right. Attrition will be happening.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So that's been kind of our mission for the past 18 years, and yeah, we're a we're not certified organic, but we're a sustainable grower. We use organic fertilizers mostly, minimal spray, no fungicide, no neonicotinoids, so we're not harming pollinators.
Yeah.
And we were also talking about pots. We reuse our plastic pots to try and eliminate some of the excess waste that way, because we always feel that it's a shame to just have those pots be only used once for one plant.
Right.
So, yeah.
So you bring them back and you do you disinfect them? How do you
We
keep
usually
them?
don't. We haven't had that much of a problem.
Oh, that's good.
We're pretty selective about our sizes, so it's not plants from a different grower, for instance, that kind of thing. So if we tend to reuse we know where our pots have been. But,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah.
Cool. So if there's one small step that you could recommend for a gardener who wanted to do some low water gardening, what would it be?
So I would suggest pick one part of your garden to concentrate on. Don't try and do the entire garden, transition it into a low water garden all at once. Sometimes taking on a big project like that can be rather daunting. And
expensive.
And expensive, yes. And you don't want to get frustrated to the point where you're going to give up. So we say pick an area of your garden. For instance, your hill strip is a good place to start.
Also known as a parking strip.
It also known as the parking strip, parkway if you're in other parts of the country.
Right.
But first step usually is removing grass, and so I've had great results with sheet mulching, which is a pretty low labor method. You cover the grass in layers of cardboard and some kind of mulch, whether it be compost or bark.
And wet it down.
Wet it down, yep. Works best in the warm season, so it can take anywhere from 3 to 6 months for the lawn to completely die. But at that point, you've got kind of a blank slate without having to use any sprays or rip out the lawn. You've got a blank slate you can work with. So picking a small area like that is a really good idea. Another thing you can do is planting in the fall or the early spring, when you benefit from natural rainfall for getting some things established. That's another thing to do if you're not there for the summer, that kind of thing, to transition that to a low water use area. And I would suggest, talk to your local nursery, do a little research on picking. There's lots of options for picking plants, but you kind of want to, approach it from the sense of creating a community, some dense plantings like we were talking about in the garden, some low growing things, and but starting with one particular area, I think, is the best
Start
way
small.
to start. Start small, yeah.
And if you succeed, then you branch out.
Exactly.
Yeah. Great. So even low water plants, just as you tell me I'm wrong, but even low water plants require water to begin with. Exactly.
Yeah, and like we always tell people this time of year, it's you can definitely plant in the summer, and plants grow really fast, but you need to be there to do the watering for them, and they're fine to plant. Usually our rainfall season, once you get to like mid to late April, from there until October or so, our rain isn't going to amount to enough to water a plant. So all plants will need some regular watering to get the roots down and established. And a lot of the really true no water plants by the second season won't need any supplemental water.
Good.
Yeah.
Good to know. So if you kill something in the first season, you probably overwatered it.
that's entirely possible.
Thanks, Greg.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks,
Great.
Bonnie. Yeah, thanks.
The one thing that I walk away with is that low water gardens don't have to be dry. I mean, they're dry, but they don't have to look dusty. It isn't like the end of the trail, and they don't have to be all spiky, and they don't have to be all thorny. And Greg certainly wasn't. He has a lot of really beautiful blossoming plants that give some softness and texture. But they do have seasons of blossom and they're distinct. So what we saw today was a garden in the middle of the summer that is existing without water, and in the springtime it's got a lot of blossom, but in the middle of the summer not so much, but that's okay.
But it's still lush.
But it's still lush, exactly, yeah. So for you?
One of the things that we are trying to focus on in small steps, and Greg alluded to it, is that if you bite off more than you can chew, you're going to often end up failing. It's like seeing a magazine when you're in the checkout of the supermarket. It says, lose 50 pounds by Thanksgiving. That's probably not going to happen, but losing 5 pounds 5 pounds by Christmas, I can do it. Start small, start manageable. Failures are going to happen, but small failures are easier to recover from than large ones.
Yeah, both emotionally and financially.
Yeah.
So
It's the journey, it's not the destination.
yeah, it's the journey. And the one other thing that I wanted to say was, it's not easy to. It's really not easy to do the research on the plants that are low water plants, because there's nobody out there who is just totally devoted to low water plants. But there's a publication, Thomas Rayner, thank you, gotta have a prompt, who's written a book called
Planting in a Post-Wild World.
Thank you. Planting in the Post-Wild World. And that is that is one of those books that anybody could learn from. So pick that up, take a look at it.
Until next time, this is Bonnie and Michael for Small Steps.